Hello, hello, and welcome to the Tom, Stu, and You podcast, where I am Stu, this is Tom, and you are you. That's a new intro. I don't know where that came
is a
from.
new intro. You've really gone for it with that one.
I mean, yeah, we'll just pull that one out of the bag and see how that, see where it lands.
Change it up every week. I like it. That's good.
I mean, try to keep everyone on our toes. Yeah, it's
Exactly. That's good.
it's episode number 44, Tom.
It is episode number 44. Been a little while. What have you been up to? A lot of snowboarding?
Yeah, a fair bit of snowboarding. Our work is picking up. You know, trying to influence the lives and careers of our future scientists in Canada. And
Very good.
that is a lot. It turns out that's a lot of work.
It sounds like a lot of work, yeah.
But it's fun. I mean, I'm definitely enjoying my life, and just thankful not to be having cold showers every single day, which is probably where we left our last episode, or one of our last episodes.
So the one before last, I think, where you were saying that you were doing this challenge where you were having a cold shower every day for a month or something like that. What is the update on that? How's that gone for you?
I mean, it's done, thankfully, and I haven't had a cold shower since. I might bring it back throughout summer, but we'll see where that goes.
Any lessons learned or observations made during that time?
Yeah, water's effing cold.
In Canada, I bet.
Yeah.
During the winter.
I would like to think it's brought about a little bit of mental resilience, but my productivity fluctuates throughout the week, so we'll see. I mean, it's quite interesting that ties so neatly into the topic of today's discussion, which is something that I've been wanting to talk about pretty much since we started the podcast. I think it's one of the first podcast ideas I wrote down. And that is of toxic masculinity, and already I can just see, like, you know, the hairs in the back of necks of men all across the country, all across the world listening to this podcast.
What are they thinking? Am I about to be offended?
Exactly. Keyboard warriors, you know, stretching their fingers like, here we go. This is what I've been waiting for.
We should probably start off by saying that, you know, anyone can be toxic, and this isn't an attack on men. Per se, it's just an observation of, like, the more detrimental behaviors that are traditionally associated with masculinity.
Absolutely.
You know, that's like, you know, we were talking just before we came on air about, like, you know, not going to the doctor if you've got a problem, and, like, internalizing problems, not speaking about your emotions or anything like that, bottling things up. And then there's those are ones that are obviously bad for yourself. And then obviously if you internalize them and bottle up and it explodes and it affects other people, that's how it can, you know, have an effect on the world as well. And then there's also, you know, ones that are based on power and domination and things like that. So those are the real ones that we are looking into today.
So I think
it's not an attack on men.
No, it's not. We're not attacking men. Two guys are not attacking men. I think the key there is that it's the negative aspects of exaggerated, traditionally masculine traits, and it's all about the cultural pressures for men to behave in a certain way, and it refers to the notion that some people's ideas of manliness and, you know, how to be a manly man, a proper man, it just perpetuates that domination, that homophobia and aggression. You know, that whole idea that men need to act tough, you know, they need to avoid showing all emotion at all costs. Those sort of expectations, I guess, can be harmful to our mental health. And it can have serious consequences for society, for the men themselves, you know, for their partners, you know, their female friends. That's how it's become known as toxic masculinity. You know, the fact that it's harmful to everyone around you. So that's the key, toxic masculinity. Now, this discussion, obviously, you know, my dumbass originally thought that maybe we could separate sexism from toxic masculinity in one conversation. I mean, like, that's just not going to happen at all.
Remember, everything's connected, Stu.
Everything is connected, even capitalism. You know, Tom is going to bring up capitalism later in this episode, which I love, but we've got to. But we are going to be talking about just in general masculinity and what is defined as, you know, being a real man. So, you know, please excuse us if you do feel offended at any point in this conversation, but we are
Get in touch if you do and tell us why.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'd love to have that, you know, discussion. Because if you are offended, you know, it's important to reach out and tell us why and have that conversation. You know, this is about breaking echo chambers, as we say. Perhaps we're in an echo chamber and we just think that toxic masculinity is a problem. Like, I really think that it is. You know, when you look around and see, you only had to look, you know, at the previous president to see a great example of toxic masculinity in action. A guy who clearly had a complex and compared himself to his predecessor, Obama, sought to destroy everything that he had done, basically. Had a complex about authoritarian leaders and kind of revered them in a way, or was envious of their power and what they could do. And he kind of wanted to do that himself. A clear and obvious misogynist, huge ego problem, terrible attitudes towards weaker men or people who he perceived as being weaker. And he was able to fuel that in a lot of other people. And I think we saw that during the Capitol insurrection and throughout his whole presidency, to be honest. So that's a prime example. Another one would be the guy called Robert O'Neill, the former Navy SEAL, who is the one who says that he shot and killed Osama bin Laden. So there we are, being macho to protect people from terrorism, but at the same time, he posted a picture of himself on Twitter without wearing a mask on a flight with the words, "I'm not a pussy." So he can protect people from terrorism, but he can't, just simply wear a mask to protect, vulnerable people. And that is toxic masculinity. That's a great, illustration of it. The fact that, he's involved in warfare, which is like traditionally a macho kind of profession. But you can't just take, a little step to protect innocent people and belittles people who are taking steps to protect other people.
Yeah, this is definitely a loaded topic. Our specialty, and it's definitely controversial in all areas of the internet and in conversation. I think it's definitely a conversation that not enough people are having. Mm-hmm. It's definitely becoming more apparent in society that toxic masculinity, or some alternative definition of it, is something that we need to address. And I imagine this episode is going to be one of many in which we explore the different ways, especially being two, male presenters on a podcast where we talk about these sort of issues. I imagine masculinity is going to come up over and over again at some point in the future, which is good because there's a lot to explore.
Definitely.
So today I think let's get a quick definition in real quick, I guess. As what is defined by some researchers, that toxic masculinity has three core components, I guess. And the first one is toughness. So this is a notion that men should be physically strong, emotionally callous, and behaviorally aggressive. Anti-femininity. So this involves the idea that men should reject anything that is considered to be feminine, such as showing emotion, accepting help, and power.
Community,
so this is
anything like that. And that's where probably homophobia and things like that come from.
Mm-hmm. And power. This is the assumption that men must work towards obtaining power and status, both social and financial, so that they gain the respect of others. And power also leads into the much bigger topic around sex, rape culture, consent, all of that sort of stuff. So that's stuff that we won't touch on in any great detail today. Like, I think today is just going to be an overview of a whole lot of different, topics that we hope to explore in more depth in the future. Yep. But this is a good start and a good way to just break down, what do we mean specifically by the phrase toxic masculinity? Not masculinity in general, but toxic masculinity. So again, it's those exaggerated forms of masculinity that some people believe in, and why it's harmful to society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, as you say, this will be kind of like a scratching the surface kind of thing on this, because I myself, before we started looking into this, into the research for this talk today, was not aware of the amount of research and study that's been done, in this area. The amount of opinion as well, and the amount of just different groups that give them different names that I didn't know existed, like the incels, the involuntary celibate guys. Mm-hmm. I did not know that this was a group that existed. So involuntary celibacy are guys who basically kind of blame women, am I right, for the fact that they can't find a partner, so they externalize the problem rather than looking at themselves and their conduct. And there was a YouTube video that we both watched for this. It was about it's like the Common Ground ones, where they brought together feminists and men's rights activists, and one of them was one of the guys was one of these. He called himself an incel, and he was quite a condescending, entitled character who obviously placed himself above the women that he was speaking to. And to me, just watching his behaviour and how he was, he never, once reflected or seemed like a guy who would reflect on his own, how he reacts with people, how he treats people. Just completely externalizes the problem rather than looking at what can I do to be a better human and come across as a nice guy, and that might put me into a better place to be able to meet someone. That entitlement and that attitude, it was a prime example of toxic masculinity to me. But yeah, there's so much to look at, so much to take in, so many different points of view. That's why it's so controversial. But I guess that, it's something that we are or that society kind of teaches us from a very early age. When you are a kid, you enter a toy store, for example, all of the boys' stuff is blue or, dark brown. It's like a man cave kind of thing, and you're directed towards that. They're often toys based on like power, like guns or swords and all that kind of stuff, whereas the girls section is always undoubtedly pink, and it's based on princesses, and there's an air of fragility that's built into that, and that's a real thing that advertising's done, I guess, as well, which also factors into it in creating a kind of common sense on gender roles and how boys and girls are different.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in it.
So the reason why this is important to discuss, the reason why we're having this conversation at all, is because, as you said, it's harmful to society. It's harmful to the men themselves. It's harmful to the females in their lives as well. So I guess to break down some of the harm that comes from these extreme examples of what we define as masculinity is probably a good place to start. So let's start with something like extreme self-reliance and the need to do everything on their own. It makes it less likely for men to seek treatment or reach out for help financially. So that's an example we've taken from the internet. Now let's get personal here. I'll start off with a personal example myself. Especially having grown up in a somewhat more conservative regional rural upbringing, which isn't bad itself. I absolutely love my upbringing. But then to have gone to an all boys boarding school for high school and then gone to college at university, I'm very much aware of this whole concept of toxic masculinity, of the fragile ego that comes with, being a man, a hyper-exaggerated version of a man. And, this has obviously influenced the way that I live my life. It's influenced my mentality, and I'm working a lot. I'm trying to break down what I had assumed was just an innate part of my personality and coming to terms with how I can see there are still various aspects of toxic masculinity within my own person. For example, I injured my shoulder snowboarding 2 years ago, and quite a bad injury. Like I had to jump over a creek real quick when I ran out of snow. Landed a bit funny, put my hand down, my body and board kept on sliding as it does on snow, and my arm stayed in place, and then yanked my shoulder all the way up and behind me. 2 years later, I finally went and saw a doctor about it. I got injections every 2 weeks for 3 months, trying to fix the problem. That didn't work. Finally went and got an ultrasound, an x-ray, and an MRI done, which cost me quite a lot of money, as it does. Imagine. And I found out that most of the cartilage in my shoulder is not there anymore, or not where it's supposed to be anymore.
Oh,
so
really?
A very bad injury that the doctor was quite surprised that I could do anything at all. And I've suffered with restricted mobility, with just small amounts of pain. And then, when I tried CrossFitting again, for example, at the end of last year, I can't lift much weight above my head because my shoulder has absolutely no stability. And when that shoulder just catches that cartilage in the wrong way, which it does quite a lot and does more and more, which is why I finally decided to get it looked at. I'm in an extreme amount of pain, so much so that I couldn't sleep some nights. So I'll be getting shoulder surgery at some point in the next 2 months or so. But that's an extreme. Well, not actually, it's not even that extreme. That's a less than extreme version of toxic masculinity influencing my own life, where I stupidly didn't go seek the medical treatment that I obviously needed. And that's not even to say anything about the fact that, men are much, much less likely to go see a therapist. They take it as an affront to their manlyhood, to that it's
To be a
you're
lone
rejected
wolf
from
kind of thing.
society if you are seen. You're seen as being weak if you go seek help. Medical attention, especially for something like mental illness. Like there's just this massive stigma about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think that what you said there then about your own personal experience with your shoulder and stuff like that. That's something that I'm sure that we both heard when we were growing up, that boys don't cry and stuff like that. And chin up and be strong and all that kind of thing, rather than talk about things that are actually hurting you, or whether that's mental, or whether that is physical. I'm very similar to you with going to the doctor and stuff like that. So is my dad. So I completely get it, but that is a form of toxic masculinity in and of itself. When you know deep down that you need help, but you for some reason put it off, and I'm not even sure why you do it. It just seems to be the done thing.
It's pride. It's your ego.
I guess
isn't it?
I guess it is. Yeah. I guess it is in a way, but
it's
it is
admitting
really
to yourself
stupid.
that you're weaker than you want to portray to other people around you.
Yeah, I guess so.
And it is. It's stupid. Like there's no logical basis behind it, besides the fact that it's just this mental side of you that you actually have to put time and effort into working on to overcome. Like that's not even the only example I have of a time where I should have said, I broke my arm once on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
Like the forearm part, like my bone. I don't even know what bone that is. I'm not a medical student, and I've forgotten everything from high school. Tibia, fibia, I don't know. And
sounds right. Yeah.
And I just kept it bandaged for 3 months because I was just too busy, and it was slightly inconvenient to go to the hospital. I finally saw a doctor about it when I went to university, and he was like, "Yeah, you broke your arm, and it's just luckily it's just healed in the right place. Otherwise, we would have had to re-break your arm and cast it again." There's no
exactly.
There's no reason why I didn't go see a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. Why don't we do that? But it is important, as you say, because on the societal level, especially if you talk about mental health and stuff like that, depression and anxiety and all these kind of things are running rife at the minute, and people need to be able to speak openly about their emotions. And I guess that's what we should be teaching, our sons and daughters, but sons to be open and be able to talk about their emotions freely without judgment. I know that it's not normal to bottle things up and keep them buried deep down. Just looking into some of the research for this episode, a 2015 study found that men who brought into traditional notions of masculinity held more of a negative attitude about seeking mental health services compared to those with more flexible attitudes. So again, it's the way that it's the way that toxic masculinity is stopping people from even seeking help when they really need it, and that goes into the suicide rate as well, which we've seen increase over since I think Mind started a report in 2009. So it was their 10-year report recently, and it found that suicide or feelings of suicide have gone up exponentially, and I think that relates to problems with toxic masculinity for sure. And I think that's also compounded by societal issues. It's compounded by issues of, especially because of the consequences of capitalism. I will come on to it more properly later, but globalization and stuff like that. The place of working class white men is not what it used to be, and they haven't sort of found a place for themselves in the 21st century. So there's that loss. And when there's that loss, there's obviously the rise of ill health and the failure to seek that treatment. But there's also the rise of acting out violently, which I guess is another one of the behaviours that is a sign of toxic masculinity, is the expression of physical or sexual or intellectual dominance over people. So that's another one for sure.
Yeah, and back to the suicide rate, for example, the numbers of suicide, for example, is disproportionately high in the population of men. It's something like 25 deaths in a population of 100,000 for men aged 40 to 50, whereas for women the highest rates of suicide are only 7 or something out of every 100,000, and that's for an age range of 50 to 59. just like a completely disproportionate percentage, or a higher likelihood of a man experiencing suicidal thoughts or actually committing suicide. And even just things like feeling about loneliness and the fact that like men don't feel like they're able to express their emotions, or that we avoid, not they, we avoid conversations about our problems or emotions. Studies have shown that feelings of isolation increases your stress levels. Not being able to feel like you're comfortable with giving people hugs or physical affection, showing signs of physical affection to your friends, male or female. These things decrease the life expectancy of men. Not only through suicide, but just in general, your health suffers because you're not able to feel like you can be your authentic self around the people you're supposed to care about. And, again, to bring a personal experience into this, my high school experience was not something that was positive for me overall. Feelings of isolation, not feeling like I was able or comfortable enough to have conversations with anyone, feeling like I was supposed to just be, chin up, don't cry, don't let anyone see that you're hurting. If you're going to cry, you're supposed to, go into your room, shut the door, hide under the covers, or you're supposed to go into the bathroom where no one can see or hear you. At no point where you're allowed to be vulnerable with anyone around you. And that took a lot of unpacking to get through. In high school, the only thing that got me through, I think, was that I had this one senior who was 5 years older than I was, that sort of took me under his wing and provided that safe space where we could have actual conversations about what I was going through. And it was just an amazing, looking back on it, it was an amazing thing that I was able to have, even if it was for only, my year 8. Like I only had him around for 1 year to provide that. And even if a lot of the advice he gave was to like toughen up, and he was the one to like tell me explicitly, like, don't let them see that you're hurting. Don't let your vulnerable side show. It was nice to be able to just like have that one safe space just for a little while.
But you could be vulnerable with that in that kind of interaction with that person.
I could. It was the first time in that year, since starting high school, that I felt like I could actually trust someone implicitly with what I was going through, and know that they were actually listening and actually caring about it. When you don't have that support from teachers, when the school pretends like bullying doesn't happen, it's an all boys boarding school. Boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys,
it'll toughen them up. It'll be good for you in the long run. Yeah, maybe it did toughen me up in the long run, but I have a lot of emotional baggage. Ask my exes. That I still need to unpack even to this day.
I can relate to that.
And it does take a long time to unpack. So, in university, I started journaling a lot, and I created a private website where I could upload my journal entries so that I can have a source of looking back on in the future. And I know that I've shared that website with a few close friends in the past, and, the first couple of times it happened, it didn't go over well. When I tried to share them with, the guy friends in my life, even some of the female friends in my life, it wasn't received the way I was hoping it to be received. It was more like, oh, like, why are you trying to be vulnerable with me right now? Like, you're supposed to keep all of this inside. You're supposed to deal with this yourself. That's a double punch to the gut right there. When you try to be vulnerable to someone and then you're shut straight back down because of social pressures. Like, that shit takes a long time to get over.
It does. And you can build walls, I'm sure. It'll build barriers and it can be harder to break those things down in the future. I think it's important to stress that being vulnerable isn't a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of like honesty and, truth and stuff like that. And that takes real courage to be able to do that. And people should start recognize it. If we could only frame it in that way, I think that it would be so much more beneficial, and people would be able to open up more about their problems without the fear of being judged or how they're going to be received by people, even close friends, as you say. When you said it was an all boys school that you grew up in, was that a good, well, not a good environment, that's the wrong word, but was that an environment in which you could see toxic masculinity in action?
It was the prime example, I think, of toxic masculinity. So, things like anti-femininity, the popular kids at school were never the ones that did drama or acting or art. The popular kids at school were always the rugby players that hit the hardest, that were the biggest, the toughest, the strongest.
Yeah.
You know, even, you know, the smart kids wanted to be tougher. You know, it was all about how competitive were you, how much could you assert your physical dominance over another kid. You know, bullying isn't just mental. It's not just physical. It's also mental. It's also mental. It's not just mental. It's also physical. Like it's a two-pronged attack, and the whole idea of like having to assert your dominance over someone else is highlighted to the extreme in that sort of environment. And similar to that, things like homophobia, for example. This is something that I struggled with for a long time, where the cool kids, it was fine for the cool kids to whip their dick out, for example, to go around, you know, kissing a guy in the face, for example, because it was all about power. It asserted your dominance, being like, I'm so comfortable in my own masculinity that like this is cool, this is fine. And you know, if you could shove someone away afterwards, it was all about like, yeah, the bros are back, you know, we're so cool, whatever. But then if you were actually expressing any sort of you know, gay tendencies, for example, if there was any doubt that you actually enjoyed that, enjoyed's not the right word, if that was your sexual preference, I guess, then you were immediately put down. And so it was this weird disconnect between like, it was cool to do the acts themselves. But if it was like a part of your identity, then it was actually a negative thing.
No, I get it completely. And definitely I can relate to a lot of those things, just going to a comprehensive school. So I went to like a mixed school, but those problems still exist, you know, you know, trying to be, you know, the biggest, the strongest, get into the football team, all that kind of stuff. They were all things that I had growing up in school. I was also like kind of a drifter in a way between groups. So like, you know, because I played football, I was on the football team, didn't always start, or, you know, didn't have teachers that really helped me to reach the levels of proper aggression that you needed for, you know, healthy, like competitive aggression that you needed from the game. Because I was always like quite small, and so I sometimes I physically couldn't compete with like, you know, bigger people.
I'm with you, man.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my thing. And then you are, throughout childhood, you're, you know, met with you know, heroes who are all muscle bound, action man. That even nowadays, I hate to think about it with kids, but you just see like Instagram is full of like muscle bound dudes and do this workout and all that sort of stuff. And during school, I did try and do, and after school, like university and stuff like that, I tried to do these workouts and try to put on muscle and stuff like that, but it's just impossible for me to do it because of my metabolism. So I was like, oh, right, well, and then I became vegan. So it's definitely, but it hasn't changed at all. But that metabolism, but it is about, you know, being strong and powerful and all that sort of stuff. And getting punched one time because like I took the football off someone in the playground, like, meaning like I tackled them like well, and they like punched me in the stomach and stuff. And then so I went to the teachers, and because like I went to the teachers, I was like a, you know, someone who dobbed someone in and stuff like that. And it was that thing that you should just get on with it and deal with it yourself. So yeah, I can relate to all those things, and I think that they are obviously a problem. And so when people have a problem when they hear about the term toxic masculinity, has always got, you know, bad connotations for those people, and they become immediately defensive. When I'm sure that a lot of people have experienced, you know, these things themselves, and they've had some sort of effect on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, a lot more to unpack, I guess. Like there's like we could touch on sex, for example, like very briefly, I guess, now as well. And you know, the whole notion that like the way to be a true man is to, you know, sleep with the most amount of women, for example. You know, that need, it's not even just a desire, that need to prove yourself, you means you're more likely to take risky behavior. You're less likely to seek consent, explicit consent. Even what we've talked about, the violence piece or the aggression piece, where to be a real man, you have to be tough and strong. You're supposed to be a little bit violent to prove to yourself that you have domination over other men, other boys, and especially other girls. That all leads to a rape culture in which we are finally seeing come out more and more that this is a problem that we need to address, and the way to address it is through the socialization piece, I guess, that we'll touch on here in a second. But the Detroit Lions linebacker DeAndre Levy. So I'm going to use a quote. Back to quote Stewart. Quote some Stewart. He said so well in his piece on consent and sexual assault that it's truly astounding how many awful things that occur in this world are because men are afraid of appearing weak. And
true.
Nailed it. That is true, right?
Definitely.
And so I think I was going to say that I think the more that men are threatened, and even just having this conversation, even the term toxic in front of masculinity, it makes men feel threatened. The more that they feel threatened, the worse they get at masculinity. And by that, I mean, the attributes we actually want from a man. The other amazing video I watched was actually from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's an award-winning author. She said that by far the worst thing we do to males by making them feel they have to be hard is that we leave them with very fragile egos. And that's precisely because of this, because we have such fragile egos, that we go out of our way, towards these extremes of masculinity that we see in the press, in the media, the toys we play growing up, in the words we use, in the phrases that are taught us as children, in the way our parents play with us. You're more likely to play more rough and tumble with your boy than you are with your girl, for example. It's precisely because of this that men embrace toxic masculinity without even realizing it.
Definitely, yeah.
And this is the whole reason why having this conversation is so important. And it's the whole reason why men must be the ones leading this conversation towards one another, because a man who is feeling threatened isn't going to listen to a woman who's trying to tell him how to live his life better. It needs to come from a place of not only empathy, which women can have, but of understanding, of actually having gone through the experiences ourselves, which is why I bring up so many personal examples in this episode to say to other men, hey, I've been where you are, I've had those experiences. This is why I now see that as an issue. This is why this is now toxic. This is why we need to change the way that we think about this.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that it is important, everything that you said there, and it's important to it's good that you're sharing your own stories, because it's important to be honest and open in trying to sort something out like this. Definitely myself. When you said ask all my exes and stuff like that, there's definitely occasions in the past when I've been an arsehole, for sure. Thought that I've known what's best, haven't really listened. But as long as you can acknowledge that, look back on your own actions and acknowledge it and see where you went wrong, I think that is a good step in the right direction to improving your life and improving your relationships with other people and how you treat other people. I think also, just going into harking back to the sex thing that you were saying, we're presented with a lot of characters in culture, like James Bond, for example, who is a guy whose occupation is violent, inherently resorts to violence to solve problems. Always gets the girl, and the consent thing with James Bond is always real weird. He basically doesn't get it. Nope. Family Guy did that thing, which was 50 no's and a yes means yes and stuff like that with James Bond.
You hear that all the time when guys are talking to one another, locker room talk, for example. They say, sex is just a numbers game. You ask enough women, eventually someone will say yes. And
exactly.
there's a bit of truth to that, but that's not the way you should be. You shouldn't be approaching it as a numbers game. You should be approaching it as saying, like, hey, I should be wanting to get to know each of these individual amazing women on their own accord, not for the sole purpose of gaining sex, which there's nothing wrong with just wanting to have sex in a relationship, but there is a disconnect between like that being the primary driver of, especially of, you know, teenagers and young adult men versus the I don't know, the more appropriate.
No, I get you. And it's like
the more healthy approach to actually dating. Yeah.
I think that comes through in shows like that are really popular today, like Love Island and stuff like that, which I hate. I've got no time for it, and I've seen it a couple of times.
You got some time for it.
I consider, well, you know, because I live with other people who
I'm
watch
kidding.
that stuff.
Yeah. Blame others, of course.
But, but it's like there's always double standards for women in those shows, and looking into the research for this, I was amazed at how many people have written a thesis based on like Love Island season 10 or whatever it is, and like just the fact that like in those scenarios as well, the men are described as like when they've, you know, had sex or whatever, they're described as legends, or they're allowed into like societies, or I think one of them was called like the Do Bits Club or something like that. So you had to have done stuff with, you know, a female in the house or the place or wherever they are to gain entry into this sort of club that they created. And that's a prime example of toxic. Shows like that are dripping with toxic masculinity. And what makes me quite afraid is that they're quite popular.
It's the same as How I Met Your Mother, right? Like Barney Stinson, the whole...
exactly.
What is it? Not Man Bible. What does he call it in the show?
I can't remember.
You know, like...
He's a caricature of it, basically.
Like, he is the most popular character because... And they make fun of Ted Mosby, you know, chasing romantic relationships, whereas, you know, Barney Stinson is looked up to because he's sleeping with all these women, and he's doing it in certain places, and he's putting on characters, and he's tricking them to sleep with him, for example. Like, that was promoted as being a big part of the show. And especially when you think about the fact that the actor who plays it, Neil Patrick Harris, is actually gay in real life. Like, it's just this whole nother level of like, how did no one see this as being an issue at the time of making it? How was it so popular? And then I have to have that self-reflection where I'm like, oh, that was my favorite TV show for a long time growing up as a kid.
And that was your favorite character, probably.
And that was probably my favorite character too. And like, it takes a lot to like have that moment of self-reflection where you're like, oh shit, like there's a lot of my values that I didn't even realize were like being instilled in me that were based upon things that are actually detrimental to the portrayal of being a real man in society.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the importance of like advertising and the media and the culture that's created through these kinds of things, through TV shows and what people consume, does have some sort of effect on a subconscious level that we're unaware of. And then it plays out in the real world with, you know, like, as you were just saying, you know, men's attitudes towards, you know, sleeping with as many women as possible is a good thing. Well, that comes from like James Bond and, you know, Barney and all that kind of stuff that you were just talking about. Just to, you know, my favourite character growing up was Batman, but he even shows signs of toxic masculinity. You know, uses violence again, is very repressed, doesn't share any of his problems or anything like that. That is it as well. In a way, and I guess that kind of thing does have an effect as well.
I mean, he's obviously got a whole bunch of mental health issues that he just does not see helpful. He expresses it through violence, you know, like the whole revenge culture and you know the glorification of revenge as, you know, that should be the primary form of getting back at someone if you feel slighted. Like, that is ridiculous. And again, but the Good Men Project, which is a website that I read quite a lot of articles about, you know, leading up to this episode, they have this article called The Difference Between Toxic Masculinity and Being a Man. And they say that one of the things that comes up frequently when we talk about toxic masculinity are the various wags who demand to know why we're labeling all men as being toxic. You know, again, it comes back to this whole, like, when men feel threatened, you know, why are we labeling all men as being toxic, evil, or otherwise malignant? That in itself is a problem in a nutshell, they say. For many people, the toxic ideas of masculinity are synonymous with being a man. And, you know, for a lot of people, like, that's exactly what we're saying. Like, for a lot of people, these things where it's like, men should be powerful, they should be tough, they shouldn't show emotion. You know,
some people say it's
they should be
as well.
anti-feminine. It's like these are the things that a lot of people like desperately hang on to, desperately cling to as being like the prime example of man. And this takes us brilliantly. It's a wonderful segue to where I want to take this conversation next. And that's the argument that, hey, it's all in our biology. Boys will be boys. We can't help it. You know, men are different from women. So let's have that chat briefly, I guess, before we move back into gender being a social construct. Which there's a lot, man. It's a lot.
But it is a lot. It is a lot.
So Asia Kate Dillon is this wonderful actress. She doesn't assign herself a gender. She says traditionally masculinity and femininity have been seen as binary polar opposites. So what I was excited to discover for myself, she says, is that what I'm excited to see happening in the larger cultural context is a redefinition of masculinity and femininity as things that are all-encompassing. So masculinity can be hard or soft, strong or vulnerable, and that those things aren't opposites of each other because being vulnerable is a sign of strength. So that's what you said earlier. But what people, the proponents of the biological argument, are saying is that no, the way that men act, so the reason they're more violent, the reason they're more aggressive, the reason why they should be the hunter, they should be the provider of the family, is that because biologically and evolutionarily, that is our role.
Yeah.
Which there are some examples and there is some evidence to support that. However, there's also a lot of research to suggest that neurologically, the differences in a boy and a girl's brain is actually not that much at all.
It's not that much at all.
And the conclusions that are achieved from a lot of the research papers looking into the biological differences between men and women have actually been interpreted quite weirdly. And it's hard to prove anything because evolution is difficult and psychology is difficult. But how humans, which goes, all the way back to our hunter-gatherer days. Now, especially the idea of high testosterone leading to higher violence, that's just something that I guess growing up, that's something that I just assumed was common knowledge. It's actually been disproven many, many times. But let's imagine that men are the way they are because of biology. Let's go on a little thought experiment here.
Because it's their human nature kind of thing. It's natural.
Because it's their human nature.
Yeah.
Sex and the desire to reproduce is in our biology. It's a primary driving motivator for any species in the animal kingdom to ensure its survival. And yet we've somehow managed to tame that inner desire to some extent at least. You don't see guys running around to every woman wanting to have sex with them all the time. And yes, I know in a club I have definitely seen examples of that happening.
Definitely seen that.
But what I'm saying is that we've been able to reprioritize areas of our life where survival through reproduction isn't necessarily the most important thing anymore. You are seeing people, sacrificing having children earlier in life to pursue careers, for example. We live in a world now where reproduction and having the most populous species on the planet isn't necessary to the survival of the human race in general anymore. So why can't we apply the same level of progress to these biological aspects of masculinity, even if we were to only believe that they were based in biology and not more so in the commonly accepted societal and behavioral constructs that we'll get onto in a second here?
I really like it when people use this kind of survival of the fittest argument, because I don't think that it works in civilized society. You have basically I say civilized society, let's just call it society.
Yeah.
You kind of have survival of the richest now. If it was a case that men acted like animals, in the sense that they're talking about, you wouldn't seek consent, which is an important thing, which is a legal requirement that we've created as humans. If I, wanted to challenge an alpha male, say if I take Jeff Bezos, for example, he's got all of the resources. In pursuant to natural law, I would just go and challenge him, kill him, and take all of his stuff. But I can't do that because we've created a system of, we created a legal system and created a system of private property that protects, that enshrines his rights against mine if I do that, and I'll end up in jail. So I hate this whole survival of the fittest, because a lot of the people who are the richest, they're not the strongest people.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't go hand in hand. And so I agree with you. I think that the way that toxic masculinity manifests itself in society is not a product of nature. I think it's a product of like surroundings and acting out against those, you know, political, social, economic things that we now prioritize as humans. Basically, so that's why I think it's important to link capitalism into this, which we'll do in a sec. But because, as I said, if you're like a middle class, white, hard-working American guy, perhaps from like the southern states or the more religious states, so there's that religious element that also subordinates women, not just in, you know, Christianity and things like that, but also in Islam and things like that. If you are someone who has no say in where you work or whether your job gets exported to, you know, exploit other people, you know, other men in different countries, cheap labour, women, whatever, then you're going to be left in a situation of economic hardship. And when you are playing by the rules and, you know, you are trying to be the strongest that you can be, you're trying to work within the system of capitalism to accumulate as much as you can, and it isn't working for you, how are you going to react? Probably with some form of violence, unless you talk about it, and then also, I think, talk about some sort of, you know, greater democratization of the economy and things like that. That's why I think it's important to bring that in as well.
Yeah, and the other piece on biology as well is that biology doesn't force boys and men to talk about women in vulgar ways in a locker room, for example. So this whole concept of like locker room talk and, you know, like, oh, it's just the way we are, you know, it's just a joke, like, get over it. It's a response based in social constructs, again, when they feel pressured to differentiate themselves from women and feminine ways of being. It's that whole anti-feminine component of toxic masculinity that we mentioned right at the start. You know, they're trying to prove their masculinity by putting others down, by showing that level of power they have over other people. You know, similarly, the phrase boys will be boys is usually used to excuse behavior that is aggressive by nature. And not only does it imply that there is only one way to be a proper boy, which there isn't, which, you know, let's get that clear, they also, and therefore grow up to be a proper man. It also perpetuates the idea that boys and girls are different, and therefore we can't blame boys for acting more violent than girls. So as I said before, neuroscientists have researched the biology of boys and girls to find that there's very, very little difference in their brains. And additionally, by using this excuse, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So boys continue to be given excuses for their behavior, and so they never learn that it isn't actually acceptable. When a boy pushes a girl over or pulls her hair, we shouldn't be telling the girl that he only does this because he's interested in her. We should be teaching our children that it's not normal to show someone that they like them by hurting them. And in an age when we're finally coming to terms with the pervasiveness of sexual assault and highlighting the importance of consent in safe, healthy relationships, we need to recognize the importance of these initial lessons in young children when they're just starting to come to age and exploring their new sexual urges. And that ties in nicely to, I guess, to our next comment about gender being a social construct, which, you know, what does that mean? But it's the way we raise boys versus girls. So, you know, as you say, the toys they play with, you know, guys, they play with these tough action men. You know, girls are supposed to play with Barbie dolls and wear dresses. And if you see a boy, you know, wearing a dress, for example, it's not only other boys that put them down, but parents and you know, neighbors. And why is your kid wearing a dress? Like, what are you doing? The whole concept of a gender reveal party just stresses once again, like, this ridiculous notion that we have to assign someone's gender at birth. Now, like, we could get into a whole big conversation on the difference between sex versus gender, sexual orientation versus gender orientation as well. But what is important to note is that while sex is biological, so, you know, how many chromosomes do you have? You know, what reproductive system do you have in your body? Your gender, however, is a social construct, and what we need to highlight now is that it starts at a much younger age than you actually expect. So it's that whole concept of, you know, playing rough with your baby when he's a boy, or, you know, being a bit softer and a bit more careful, a bit more softly spoken with the daughter. You know, boy sports are usually more competitive and rough, whereas, you know, one of my friends was telling me, you know, she wanted to play with the boys because they played tackle football, but because she was a girl, the school was like, no, like, you're not playing ice hockey with the boys. You're going to be playing, you know, grass hockey with the girls, because that way you don't hurt yourself. You know, this whole treating women like they're fragile beings from a young age, of course it's going to, perpetuate this idea that men are tougher and should be tougher and should be harder. And, you know, there's research done on, Amazonian tribes, for example, on, Native Americans, lots of different tribal cultures around the world. The whole idea, the whole reason we know about the Amazons was that they went against gender stereotypes of like the Western people that were trying to conquer their lands, basically. Like the fact that they existed in isolated communities around the world kind of suggests that, hey, maybe it's not innately biological. Well, yes, there is evidence to prove that like men are generally stronger and physically bigger, and they're more disposable because they don't have to care for and nurture a baby. In the hunter-gatherer days, while that might have made sense, we don't live in those days anymore. So much of the way we live our lives no longer relates to the hunter-gatherer days. So why do we still stick to this whole idea that if you're a man, you should have to still be the main provider in the family when you don't have to be physically tough to be a provider anymore? But even if that was the case, like there's examples of women who were in these tribal communities that were the main provider and the guys stayed at home. So
yeah, of course.
The biological argument is one that's very difficult to stick by, whereas the argument for social construct is much more evident. And I mean, even if there were biological differences, shouldn't we want to create a more equal world? Like when children play, it's often boys versus girls, even without adult involvement, right? So this is an argument, again, that it's all biological, where boys learn dominance over girls from a young age, and they learn that sexes are different from one another. And while there are great steps in encouraging girls to get more involved in sport, for example, teaching them competitiveness, it also says a greater need that if teachers and adults go out of their ways to help organize children's play and, make sure it is more egalitarian, this could be a case for socialization overriding biological differences if they do indeed exist.
Yeah, of course. I think that the whole nature and social construct thing I think it's quite obvious that gender is a social construct. And when people talk about it being natural or, biology and stuff like that, people who make these arguments about nature often do it very selectively. So they'll only pick certain things that like match their argument. Yeah. Just going there, like what you play with as a child and how you're treated as a boy differently to how you're treated as a girl, when you're a child. That's all a social construct. It's all kind of this common sense, this status quo thing that we keep alluding to. It keeps coming up. I think that it would be the case, much as if like, if a child born in China grows up in the UK, they're going to speak English. So if like if a boy played with, a boy could play with anything. Like a boy could play with Barbies or whatever. It doesn't matter. So the fact that you're telling them not to do it, or that that it's looked down upon, or that there's a feeling created that it shouldn't happen, that's the construct that we're talking about.
And this is before we even get into the whole transgender, fluid gender, androgynous, and then bringing into sexual orientation, and like there's a lot of different things that combine here that we're intentionally not getting involved in because it's not our personal experiences. But there's a whole lot more to this argument than what we're even saying now.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what I've garnered from doing the research and looking into this and kind of reflecting on it is that I think that when you have a system that I perceive to be inherently violent, it's going to cause symptoms such as toxic masculinity to come out. Now, we've talked about the ramifications of history, in a previous episode, and how that ripples through to this day. If you think about it, women were only enfranchised 100 years ago. You still have religions that subordinate women under men for various illogical reasons that don't stand up to any scrutiny. That has an effect on society still to this day. If you have because I'm going to bring up capitalism now, obviously. So if you have a system designed by men that is exploitative, that often ends up in violence, look at America, for example. It's been in a war practically every year of its existence in some form. Just look at the amount that America spends on its military budget compared to what it spends on social care, healthcare, all those kinds of, community enriching things. It dwarfs all of it. The UK is going the same way, with their recent announcement of 16 billion for, defence, and wanting Britain and talking about imperialist kind of language and rhetoric and stuff like that. If the system's violent like that, if the system doesn't care about people being made, unemployed, losing jobs, if the impetus for directors of companies is to make profit, how can we make profit? Well, if we cut these jobs here and, export it overseas, globalization, and exploit cheap labor, what happens to those people doesn't matter. So this is why I keep coming back to, the white working class men and, anyone who's working class who has their jobs automated or shipped off overseas. What are they supposed to do in that system? And then there's no real social security. You can't live off what social security there is in a lot of countries. That's a system of violence. And so when you have a system of violence, it's going to create these manifestations such as toxic masculinity, that you've got to be powerful to get to the top of this food chain that is capitalism, to be able to survive. And that's how it works. And you are entitled to do that in this sort of kind of food chain that is created with capitalism. It's interesting to me, because we obviously spoke to Robin last week about socialism. We've looked into socialism. We spoke with Sarah and Kaylee about feminism. So it's interesting to me to note that, is women getting to the top of such a system, such a violent system, necessarily a good thing for feminism? Have women internalized in a way aspects of toxic masculinity, that you've got to be powerful, that you've got to, like Thatcher, there's no such thing as a society, it's just the individual. There's no solidarity, which is what, original feminism was based on, about community and solidarity and things like that. There's never been a woman president of the United States. So it's kind of, women have been scared to come out until recently, like Me Too and stuff like that. They've been suppressed. And that is because there's a general environment created by what I would think is like toxic masculine traits that mean that women feel like they're not going to be believed and things like that. Or that there's too much power with men to be able to come forward on those things. So loads of questions. The internalization of these traits for women is a real interesting one for me, because obviously original feminism was based in solidarity and all that kind of thing. So basically, this is something that I've been struggling with quite recently, and maybe people can get in touch and tell me what they think is that is. Obviously, there should be equality and things like that, but is a woman succeeding in what I think is a violent system created by men good for feminism, or does it come about through internalizing like the need for power, the need to exploit people? There's a really good Disney Pixar short called Pearl that people should watch. It's based in like a corporate environment, and this little ball of wool, she's all colourful on the day that she goes in. She goes into the corporate sphere, and it's all the the locker room talk going on around the coffee pot and all that sort of stuff. She sticks out like a sore thumb, and in order to fit in, she has to re-knit herself into like a business attire, and she has to be powerful, and she has to make harsh decisions. And then she's accepted. She starts getting invited to like Wings Night and stuff like that. And then a new ball of wool turns up, and they're all going off, and she's like wants to be involved, but they're not going to involve her. And obviously, at the last minute, Pearl comes out and gets her involved and stuff like that. But
spoiler. So
that's obviously like a Disney ending to the situation I'm talking about. I don't think that normally happens. So it's just an interesting aspect, I think, and people should obviously watch that because it's a pretty good pretty good little video.
Yeah, I think on that I have another quote, obviously. It's from a cultural anthropologist, Katrina Karkazi. She says, if we accept that gender hierarchies are tied to evolution and biology, then it seems impossible to change. Testosterone often gives men a pass for their negative behavior and a pass for their success. If biology and testosterone aren't the explanation, then we have the much harder work to do of addressing the social causes. I hope that we can stop attaching so many behaviors to masculinity as though they're exclusively the province of men, because they often happen to be things that are valued, like risk-taking or athleticism. And so I guess to your point then, it's a twofold approach, I guess. Like, yes, we should be supporting women to embrace more of these masculine traits that we see as being valued in today's society, but also we should be changing what is valued in society to say that, like, hey, it's not healthy for anyone if we continue to promote toxic masculinity as being traits that are required to become successful, to be successful in this world. So it's a bit like we need to reestablish what we mean by being a good man, and we also need to reestablish what women should be looking for from a good man, and also, toxic femininity also exists, right? So
anyone can be toxic, for sure.
We need to be careful about how do we get both sides to tap into the empathy, not just sympathy, because sympathy is fleeting. You can feel sorry for someone today and then not even think about it. That's a quote directly from the founder of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke. You need to find that personal level of connection that brings about the empathy in you, so that you can truly reflect on what it means, what it means to be a good man, what it means to be a good woman, what it means to be a good citizen of this world. I think that ties nicely into, I guess, how we wrap up this episode, and that's chatting just briefly about the actual use of the word toxic in front of masculinity. So, as I said earlier, when men are attacked, when they feel threatened, they're more likely to become worse at being masculine. It's the use of the word toxic is actually quite triggering for a lot of people. Obviously, no one wants to be called toxic. And, when toxic masculinity is often misrepresented in saying that, like, all men are toxic, then, of course, there's people like that incel in that video we watched, and, men's rights activists that jump up trying to defend their position, trying to defend men's rights because they feel like they're being attacked because we're using the word toxic. Now, there's actually a brilliant author. She's from Canada. She's written a book called For the Love of Men, From Toxic to More Mindful Masculinity. And she says that so much of the conversation, her name is Liz Plank, she's a journalist, so much of the conversation around men is negative, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement, and there are a million reasons for that. Women have been hurt by men, and women have been traumatized. She herself has been traumatized by men. But she wants to approach this conversation differently because the way we've been approaching it so far doesn't work. She wanted to come up with a term that was positive, one that signaled a decluttering of masculinity, like a conscious spring cleaning. So mindful masculinity is the Marie Kondo approach to gender, she says. So does this spark joy for me? What kind of behaviors do I like? What kind of attitudes do I like? And what don't I like? And so she says, I think women have been taught how to do that. They've been encouraged to take on behaviors that are more, quote unquote, traditionally masculine. So to be more assertive, to communicate in a way that's more in line with the way men communicate, to unlearn their passivity and other, quote unquote, feminine behaviors of making yourself smaller, which is perfectly exampled in that that Disney short that you mentioned. She says she wants to give men the opportunity to do the same thing. And I think that's such a brilliant way to wrap up this episode. And it's take a look at, if you feel triggered by the term toxic masculinity, take a couple of seconds to think about why it is that is triggering to you. Because the definition to me is very clear in that it lists things that are obviously harmful to not only me, but to the people around me and therefore society in general. So if it's not the definition of the term that's triggering for me, then it's the fact that I'm feeling like my masculinity is trying to be taken away from me. And I can empathize with men across the world. I struggle to know my place in this world. Like, what does it mean to be a good man? I grew up, as I said, in an all-boys boarding school. I grew up in the college environment where, the biggest, strongest, toughest were the most popular, for example. I grew up reading a blog called The Art of Manliness, which focuses a lot on, war culture, being tough, choosing the hard way. He actually has a piece that I was going to bring up in this episode as well. Maybe I can touch on it briefly as like a possible disagreeing with some of our points. And he says, some today have called for men to remove their masks, claiming that the injunction to be strong, stoic, courageous, competitive, competent, and self-reliant stifles men's ability to be their true selves and leads to the dissemination of toxic masculinity. But masks themselves don't cause toxic masculinity. In fact, masks are precisely what keep it in check. The problem is not the masks men wear, but that in recent times they haven't been coupled with another, the mask of decorum, self-restraint, and civility. And a lot of that article in general, so why should we celebrate the mask of masculinity, I actually disagreed with. But I think his intent underlying it, even if some of the other articles he espouses the fact that it's not that we it's not that the solution is to become less traditionally masculine. He actually says that we should become more traditionally masculine to fix a lot of these problems. I think we'd have a lot in common with the whole idea that, one, it doesn't have to be purely the arena of masculinity. Women should also be strong, stoic, courageous, competitive, competent, and self-reliant. It shouldn't just be a man's duty. But also, we should all have some level of self-restraint. We should also have some level of self-respect to say that, hey, I can see that the way I feel, the way I'm thinking about how to be a man, the fact that I need to belittle other people to feel good about myself, that's not self-respect. That's not civility. That's not decorum. Where's the honor in that? So, yes, some traditional values we should be bringing back. Like, we should be honorable people. We should be trying to be gentlemen. But we should also be looking for women to be gentlemen as well. And we should be looking for men to be okay with the fact that you can share your feelings. You should talk to other people about the struggles you're going through. It's not a sign of weakness to admit that life is really hard right now. And it's not just an issue that men face. Women can face it as well. We, as two men hosting this podcast, have just focused on toxic masculinity in this episode. It's obviously a much wider, all-encompassing issue that is facing so many different aspects of society. But I know my next step is definitely, and I've already bought that book, but my next step is going to be reading For the Love of Men.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I think that's good. And I think other things that people can do are, especially during this time with the pandemic, maybe it's a good time for a reset in so many ways, who we value in society and all those kind of things. Or maybe it's a good time to reach out to, your friends who are guys and things like that and check in and see how they're doing, because it's a tough time for everyone. And see if you can have, if they say I'm fine, say I'm going to keep asking until you tell me, until I get a better answer, basically. So I think that's one of the ways that we can start to break through this, is to start having more honest conversations with each other, and realize that there's strength in vulnerability, which is certainly something that I've got from doing this research and things like that. I've been quite lucky in that respect, just in terms of like my family and stuff like that, because I've always had a good relationship with my mum and stuff. So I've always felt like I've been able to tell her anything, and I know that's not the case for a lot of people. So I've always had that. If I've had an issue and things like that, I have bottled them up for a time for sure, but it's always come out, and like I've always been able to talk to her or my dad or whatever, and been able to talk, and it always is good to talk things through. And so I think that's what I'd say to people, is to get in touch with guy friends and everyone at the moment, especially during the pandemic, and just see how people are doing.
Yeah, don't just write this off as being bullshit, because I know that's going to be the initial gut response for a lot of people listening to this episode, is like, oh, what a load of crap, like men should be men, women should be women, cancel culture, the woke left, how many more of those sort of terms can we possibly throw around? But, words matter, toys matter. Like I had this had an argument, a productive discussion with a mutual friend of ours, Tom, about, why the Mr. Potato Head was such an issue and why it's good that they've removed the Mr. from the Potato Head brand. Representation matters. Like, all we are looking for is to give people the chance to live the lives they wish to live without feeling like they need to meet certain societal expectations. Yes, it's good for yes, it's good that there is some pressure to like be a good person, to, live well. As that Art of Manliness says, like, it's good that like we want all people to be strong. We want all people to be courageous and competent and self-reliant. But what's happening is that it's only men that are celebrated for being that way, I guess. And that's the whole point.
There's nothing wrong with there's right ways to channel like aggression and competition and stuff like that, and sports is a great way to do it for sure. And just on the toy thing, let kids play with anything, or pick dinosaurs because dinosaurs are for everyone.
We'll have to do an episode on dinosaurs just a time.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm there. I'm already prepared for that one.
Excellent. Well, if you liked this conversation, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, because it does help us reach more people, and people like to see that other people are enjoying our content. Tag us on social media at Tom, Stu and You on Instagram, Facebook, and on Twitter. Please send us an email, leave us a comment, drop us a line if you have any thoughts, feelings, concerns, questions, follow-up points, counter-arguments. If you think this whole episode has been a complete waste of your hour and 12 minutes, then please let us know, and I don't know. I'm not going to say sorry, actually. I don't know.
We'll invite you on to talk about why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll put you in front of a camera. And if you have any ideas that you'd like us to talk about, any topics you'd like to cover, if you have a guest in mind for us, please do let us know. Like, we're expanding our reach and trying to break the echo chambers of your social media and of your daily lives, with more and more guests and with more and more topics like this. So, please do reach out to people. Like, ask how you're going. Honestly, like, if you want to talk about anything, please do get in touch with us. But until next time, we'll have another amazing episode for you in probably 2 weeks' time.
Cool. Cheers, everyone. Stay safe. Until next time.
Bye.